Well, as we reported here last night, Donald Trump will not have a third term in the presidency. We're beginning once again tonight with something that is not actually news, shouldn't be treated as news. Today, even Donald Trump himself gave up the game of using talk of a Trump third term as a way of diverting news attention away from the Trump cruelties, especially the denial of food to hungry people around the world and soon here in the United States. That is what the third term talk was supposed to do and largely succeeded in doing, get the TV pundits to talk about the third term instead of talking about taking food and medicine away from the poorest people in the world when Donald Trump closed down the United States Agency for International Development. Have pundits talk about the third term in welcoming tones in right-wing media and terrified tones in the rest of the media so that they are not talking about the Epstein files, so that they're not talking about Donald Trump becoming the first president in history to suspend the food stamp program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This program always recognized the Trump third term talk as a diversionary tactic, not to be indulged, but only to be identified as the diversionary tactic that it is. Today, Donald Trump himself finally was forced to admit today, no doubt at the urging of Republicans in Congress who would find it unbearable to go into next year's congressional elections with Donald Trump threatening, no matter how empty the threat, a third Trump term. And so we reported here last night on how the Republican Speaker of the House went out of his way yesterday to make it very clear that it is absolutely constitutionally impossible for Donald Trump to run for a third term. The Speaker was forced to publicly explain what every American high school student is supposed to already know, that it would take an amendment to the Constitution to allow for a third term. And an amendment to the Constitution requires a two-thirds vote of the United States Senate, which is currently politically impossible, and a two-thirds vote of the House of Representatives, which is currently politically impossible. The amendment would then have to be approved by three-fourths of the states, another political impossibility in today's politics. In fact, a new best-selling book by Harvard history professor Jill Lepore makes the convincing case that amending the Constitution has become politically impossible in this country. And so, impossibility is written all over the notion of a third presidential term, and Republicans are supposed to know that because it was the Republican Party that created term limits for the presidency through a constitutional amendment. After the most popular president in history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected president 4 consecutive times beginning in 1932, Republicans went to work to prevent that from ever happening again. After his final reelection campaign in 1944, President Roosevelt died in office the next year, in April of 1945, with the end of World War II in sight. Before the next presidential election, Republicans in Congress introduced an amendment creating the term limit in the presidency of 2 terms. It was passed in the House of Representatives and the Senate, with every Republican voting for it, while most Democrats voted against it. The amendment was finally ratified in 1951, which meant that every president after Franklin Roosevelt was subject to a 2-term limit, thanks entirely to Republican Party bitterness about Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt winning the presidency 4 elections in a row. Donald Trump knows none of that because it lives in a space called history, about which Donald Trump is functionally illiterate. Today on Air Force One, while speaking to reporters lobbing the softest of softball questions, as usual, Donald Trump was asked, "Sir, Speaker Johnson says that he told you that there's no time to amend the Constitution to allow you to serve a third term. Is that an accurate representation of the conversation you have?" Donald Trump: "I don't know. I don't want to even talk about that because, you know, the sad thing is I have my highest numbers that I've ever had." Okay, let's pause for a parenthetical on those highest numbers he's ever had. The highest approval rating Donald Trump has ever had was 49% during his first term as president, according to Gallup. His approval rating is currently 41%. In other words, like his first term, Donald Trump is carrying an approval rating that would make it impossible for him to win re-election to the presidency. Every Republican president in the history of polling has had higher poll numbers than Donald Trump has ever had. George W. Bush's top approval polling was 90%. His father before him, George H.W. Bush, reached an 89% job approval. Ronald Reagan won 49 states in his reelection campaign as a Republican president. And the Republican president who was never elected, President Jerry Ford, hit a high of 71% for his job approval rating. Richard Nixon, who left office in disgrace, won his second term by winning 49 states. General Dwight Eisenhower, who won World War II in Europe, became President Eisenhower in 1953 and had approval ratings far above Donald Trump's best day. There has never been a Republican president in the history of polling, which began in the 1930s, who did not hit much higher approval ratings than Donald Trump has ever had. Donald Trump finished his rambling response to that reporter by saying, quote, "You know, based on what I read, I guess I'm not allowed to run. So we'll see what happens." He doesn't read anything, so he doesn't mean the Constitution. The next question to Donald Trump was, Speaker Johnson says you're trolling when you talk about a third term. Are you trolling or are you serious? To which Donald Trump said, I don't think he said that. I don't think he used that term. Oh, really?
The Trump 2028 cap is one of the most popular that's ever been produced, and he has a good time with that, trolling the Democrats.
Yeah, Donald. He said troll.
Former President Donald Trump's recent talk about seeking a third term in office has been exposed as a deliberate distraction from a series of controversial actions and policy decisions that critics describe as cruel and authoritarian. Analysts say Trump's remarks were never serious, but were instead designed to divert public attention away from his administration's growing scandals, particularly his moves to cut food and humanitarian aid programs. Trump's latest statements, made while traveling on Air Force One, came after mounting pressure from within his own party to stop fueling speculation about serving beyond 2 terms. Congressional Republicans, alarmed at how such talk could damage their prospects in upcoming elections, reportedly urged Trump to end the third-term narrative. The Republican Speaker of the House publicly clarified that a third presidential term is constitutionally impossible, reminding the nation that the 22nd Amendment strictly limits presidents to 2 terms. Legal experts note that changing this would require an amendment to the Constitution, needing 2/3 approval in both chambers of Congress and ratification by 3/4 of U.S. states, a process widely considered politically impossible in the current climate. Historians also emphasize that the 2-term limit was created by Republicans themselves in 1951, after Franklin D. Roosevelt's unprecedented 4 elections as a Democrat. Despite this history, Trump appeared unaware or dismissive of the facts, telling reporters, "Based on what I read, I guess I'm not allowed to run." Observers pointed out that Trump's supposed highest numbers ever claim was also false. According to Gallup, his peak approval rating was 49% during his first term, far below every other Republican president in modern polling history. George W. Bush once reached 90%, Ronald Reagan won 49 states in his reelection, and even Richard Nixon, who resigned in disgrace, won 49 states in 1972. Trump's current approval rating stands at just 41%, making his return to office statistically unlikely. Critics say Trump's repeated exaggerations and false claims are part of a pattern, using controversy to distract from deeper issues within his administration. As media attention swirled around the third-term remarks, 2 major developments inside the Department of Justice went largely unnoticed. Reports surfaced that 2 federal prosecutors, Carlos Valdivia and Samuel White, were placed on administrative leave after filing a sentencing memo that directly linked the January 6th Capitol riot to Trump supporters and rhetoric. The memo, recommending a 27-month prison term for rioter Taylor Taranto, described how thousands attacked the U.S. Capitol while Congress met to certify the 2020 election results. Taranto, who was later arrested near former President Obama's home with weapons and ammunition, had been pardoned by Trump for his earlier involvement in the riot. The Justice Department quickly removed the original memo from the record, claiming it had been filed in error, and refiled it with references to Trump's involvement removed. 2 new prosecutors were then assigned to the case, a move critics described as political interference and further evidence that the department was being used as a propaganda tool rather than an impartial law enforcement body. Meanwhile, controversy continued to swirl around the FBI's leadership. Reports accused the current FBI director of abusing taxpayer-funded government jets for personal use including trips to visit a girlfriend living in Nashville. Former agents allege this was the first time an FBI director had used official transportation for personal romantic travel, prompting critics to nickname him Keystone Cash, a reference to the bumbling Keystone Cops of early film comedy. The revelations add to mounting concerns about corruption, misuse of power, and the erosion of norms within federal institutions under Trump's influence. Commentators warn that such behavior, from misleading the public about constitutional limits to using federal agencies for personal and political purposes, reflects a growing disregard for law and accountability at the highest levels of government. Although Trump's third term talk may have subsided for now, analysts caution that it could resurface as a rallying tactic to energize his base or deflect